The stars beyond. I never believed in the supernatural or the paranormal. I thought of UFOs and alien abductions as the stuff of crackpots and conspiracy theorists. But everything changed one cold night in December, when I learned that some things are more real and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. It started with a noise, a low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of my house. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the kind of tired that should have pulled me under but didn't. The hum was unsettling, almost like the sound of a distant engine, but it was more organic, if that makes any sense. I sat up in bed, listening. The noise wasn't coming from outside, but it also wasn't coming from inside the house. It was everywhere at once, surrounding me, filling my mind. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake the growing sense of unease that gripped my chest. It was an inexplicable feeling, like I was being watched. The clock on my nightstand blinked 2:37 a.m. in harsh red digits. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a strange compulsion to go outside, as if something was calling to me. My heart pounded in my chest, and though every rational part of my mind screamed at me to stay in bed, my feet found the floor. It was as if my body was no longer my own. I threw on a coat and slipped into my boots, the hum now pulsing through my bones, a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. Cold air hit me like a slap when I opened the door, but I barely noticed it. The night was eerily still, the moon hanging low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. The hum was coming from the woods behind my house. I don't know why I walked toward it. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the strange pull that had seized control of my will. Trees loomed overhead as I stepped into the forest, their branches skeletal against the starless sky. The world seemed to narrow, the path ahead of me the only thing that existed. As I walked deeper into the woods, the hum grew louder, more defined. It was almost musical now, a haunting melody that filled my ears and resonated in my skull. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, each step taking me further from the safety of my home. The deeper I went, the more the world around me changed. The air grew thicker, charged with static, and the darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing the moonlight. The trees around me seemed to twist and warp, their bark rippling as if they were alive. And then I saw it, a light in the distance, bright and pulsating, cutting through the darkness, like a beacon. I should have turned back. I should have run. But instead, I walked toward it, as if drawn by some invisible force. The light grew brighter with each step, until it became blinding. I shielded my eyes, but the light seemed to pierce through my skin, straight to my bones. And then, everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the forest floor. The light was gone, and the hum had faded to a distant memory. Cold bit into my skin, and I realized I was shivering, my breath coming in ragged bursts. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But as I sat up, I felt a strange sensation in my arm. I looked down and saw a small round mark on my forearm, like a burn or a brand. It was red and angry, the skin around it raised and inflamed. Panic surged through me as I touched it, the skin hot to the touch. What had happened to me? I stumbled to my feet and ran back to the house, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. What had that light been? Why had I walked into the woods? And what was this mark on my arm? But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something deep inside me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blinding light, felt that strange pull in my chest. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I woke in a cold sweat, the mark on my arm burning like fire. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows flitting across the walls of my house. The hum returned, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in the middle of the day, always just on the edge of hearing, like a distant memory trying to force its way back into my mind. And then the dreams started. Horrible, vivid dreams of being taken, floating above my bed, paralyzed as strange beings surrounded me. Their faces were obscured by shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They spoke in that same incomprehensible language, their voices echoing in my skull. I would wake up screaming, the mark on my arm throbbing with pain. I tried to ignore it, convince myself that it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew that something was coming for me. Something that had started the night I walked into the woods. The dreams grew worse, more intense, until I could no longer tell where the dreams ended and reality began. I started seeing things. Flashes of light in the sky, strange symbols burned into the ground outside my house. The mark on my arm began to spread, red lines snaking up toward my shoulder, like some kind of infection. I went to the doctor, but they couldn't explain it. They took blood samples, ran tests, but everything came back normal. They told me it was probably just stress, prescribed some medication to help me sleep. But the pills did nothing to stop the dreams. I became obsessed with finding answers, spending hours online, researching alien abductions and strange phenomena. The stories I found were eerily similar to what I was experiencing. Bright lights, strange markings, missing time. But the more I read, the more terrified I became. Because all of the stories ended the same way. The person disappearing, never to be seen again. The thought of vanishing, of being taken by whatever had marked me, filled me with a dread I couldn't escape. I tried to go about my life, to pretend that everything was normal, but the fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. And then, one night, the hum returned, louder than ever before. It was so loud it felt like my head would explode, the sound vibrating through every cell in my body. I tried to block it out, to cover my ears, but it was inside me, tearing me apart from the inside. I fell to the floor, screaming, as the light returned, flooding my vision. My body was no longer my own, frozen in place as the light grew brighter, hotter, until it consumed everything. I felt myself being lifted, pulled away from the ground, the house, the world. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light, the hum, the pain, all gone. I was lying on the floor of my living room, gasping for breath, the mark on my arm burning like it was on fire. I was alone, but I could feel them, watching me, waiting. I don't know how much time passed as I lay there, but eventually I forced myself to move. I had to get out of there, to escape whatever was coming for me. But as I reached for the door, I saw it. Figure standing outside the window, silhouetted against the moonlight. Was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and a head that was too large for its body. Its eyes glowed with that same unnatural light, piercing through the darkness, through the glass, straight into my soul. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob as it stared at me, unblinking. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand and placed it against the window, its fingers long and thin, like the branches of a dead tree. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the mark on its palm, the same mark that was burned into my arm. It spoke, its voice a low, rumbling hum that vibrated through my chest. The words were foreign, incomprehensible, but I understood them all the same. We are coming. The days following that night blurred together into a haze of fear and confusion. Sleep eluded me, replaced by restless hours spent poring over books, articles, and websites. Anything that might help me make sense of what was happening. The mark on my arm itched constantly, like an irritating reminder of what I had seen, of what was coming. Every time I looked at it, a wave of nausea washed over me, as if my body knew something my mind wasn't ready to accept. The figure by the window haunted my thoughts, its glowing eyes seared into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But even more terrifying was the knowledge that this wasn't just about me. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. I wasn't the first to experience this, and I wouldn't be the last. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them sitting at home, slowly losing my mind. The internet was a cesspool of half-truths and wild theories, most of which seemed too outlandish even for my current situation. But there were patterns, recurring themes that I couldn't ignore. It was as if a tapestry of terror was slowly unfurling before me, each thread leading back to the same conclusion. The beings that had come for me were ancient, and they had been here before. It was late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the living room, when I came across a name that sent a chill down my spine. Dr. Elias. He was a professor of ancient history, specializing in mythology and folklore, with a focus on what he called interdimensional entities. The mere mention of his work in an obscure forum had sparked a heated debate, with some dismissing him as a crackpot, while others swore by his research. According to those who took him seriously, Klein believed that stories of gods, demons, and spirits from various cultures were actually accounts of beings from another dimension, beings that could cross into our world under certain conditions. These beings, he claimed, were not bound by the same physical laws as humans, and they had been influencing humanity for millennia. The descriptions of these entities bore an eerie resemblance to the figure I had seen, tall, with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. My hands shook as I dialed the number I found for him. The phone rang 3 times before it clicked, and a deep, gravelly voice answered. "This is Dr. Klein." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat. Finally, I forced them out, the desperation clear in my voice. "My name is... I don't know where else to turn. Something is happening to me, something I can't explain. I think it's connected to your work." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough for me to wonder if he'd hung up. Then he spoke, his tone cautious but not dismissive. "Tell me what happened." So I did. I recounted the events of that night in the woods. The mark on my arm, the dreams, figure by the window. As I spoke, the weight of what I was saying began to settle on my chest, pressing down until I could barely breathe. I hadn't realized how much I needed to tell someone, anyone, until the words came spilling out in a frantic rush. When I finished, there was silence. I gripped the phone, waiting, praying that I hadn't just made a fool of myself. Finally, Klein sighed, a weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "You're not the first to experience this," he said quietly, "and you won't be the last." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, confirming what I had feared most. "What are they?" I whispered. "What do they want?" "That," Klein said, "is the question that has haunted me for decades. They are not of this world, that much is certain. They exist on a different plane, one that occasionally intersects with ours. The mark on your arm, it's a sign that they've chosen you for something. What that is, I can't say for sure." Chosen. Word tasted bitter in my mouth. "For what?" Klein hesitated. "I've interviewed many who've been marked like you. Some vanish without a trace. Others, they change. They become different, less human. It's as if the mark is a doorway, connection between our world and theirs. Once you're marked, they can find you anywhere." Cold shiver ran down my spine. "So there's no escape?" "Running won't help," Klein said, his voice firm. "But there may be a way to understand what's happening to you. Fight back. I've been studying these beings for most of my life. I've gathered evidence, stories, artifacts, things that might help us uncover their purpose." "Us?" I asked, flicker of hope sparking in my chest. "Yes," Klein replied. "Come to my home. I live in a remote area, away from prying eyes. We can go through my research, see if there's anything that can shed light on your situation. But I warn you, it won't be easy, and the answers we find may not be ones you want to hear." Desperation had already pushed me this far, and I was willing to go further. "Where do I find you?" Klein gave me directions to his house, a secluded property deep in the mountains, hours away from the city. He urged me to come quickly, before the beings could take further action. I agreed and hung up, my mind reeling. The thought of traveling into the unknown, placing my trust in a stranger who might be as crazy as the theories he espoused, terrified me. But the alternative, staying here, waiting for those creatures to come for me again, was far worse. I packed a small bag, my movements mechanical, driven by fear and adrenaline. I grabbed my car keys and paused at the door, glancing back at the living room where it had all started. The shadows had deepened, the room now bathed in the dim light of dusk. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement outside the window, a brief flash of glowing eyes. But when I blinked, it was gone. With a final, shaky breath, I stepped outside and locked the door behind me. The drive to Klein's house was long and treacherous, the narrow mountain roads winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around me as night fell. My mind raced with possibility, each one more terrifying than the last. What if Klein was wrong? What if there was no way to fight back? What if the beings were already waiting for me, lurking in the darkness, ready to strike the moment I let my guard down? The hum returned as I neared Klein's property. a low, insistent vibration that pulsed through the car, rattling the windows. It was weaker than before, still there. Constant reminder that I was never truly alone. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and pushed the car harder up the winding path. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it. A large, old-fashioned house perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the valley below. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a ghost story, with its tall, narrow windows and dark, weathered wood. A single light burned in one of the upstairs windows, a beacon in the darkness. I parked the car and stepped out, cold mountain air biting at my skin. The hum intensified, resonating through my bones, but I forced myself to ignore it as I approached the front door. Before I could knock, it swung open, and there stood Dr. Elias Klein. He was older than I'd expected, his hair a wild tangle of gray, his face lined with age and worry, but his eyes, those sharp, piercing eyes, were filled with a fierce intelligence that immediately put me at ease. "You made it," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Come in quickly. We don't have much time." I hurried inside, and Klein shut the door behind me, locking it with several deadbolts. The interior of the house was cluttered, every surface covered with books, papers, and strange artifacts. The walls were lined with shelves, crammed full of old tomes and dusty relics that looked like they belonged in a museum. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and musty paper, a strange but oddly comforting smell. "Sorry for the mess," Klein said, leading me through the maze of clutter. "I don't get many visitors." "Don't worry about it," I replied, my eyes darting around the room. "What is all this?" "Research," Klein said simply. "Years and years of it. Everything I've learned about these beings, everything I've gathered from those who've encountered them, it's all here." He led me to a small sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Klein gestured for me to sit, and I sank into an old, worn armchair, my body tense with anxiety. Klein sat across from me, leaning forward with a serious expression. "Before we begin, I need to know everything, every detail, no matter how small. Start from the beginning." So I did. I recounted the events of that night once again. A hum, the light, the mark on my arm, figure by the window. As I spoke, Klein listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes in a battered leather journal. When I finished, Klein sat back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's as I feared," he said, his voice heavy. "The mark, they've chosen you for something specific, something important. They don't just take anyone, they select their targets with care." "Why me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What did I do?" Klein shook his head. "It's not about what you did, but what you represent. There's something about you that they need, something that ties you to them. It could be a latent ability, a connection to a specific place or event, or even something in your bloodline. Whatever it is, they've marked you because you're valuable to them." He stood and walked over to one of the shelves, pulling down a thick, leather-bound book. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, then brought the book over to me. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a drawing on one of the pages. It was a crude sketch, but the figure it depicted was unmistakable, tall, with long limbs and glowing eyes. Beneath the figure was a symbol, a circle with intricate lines radiating out from the center, similar to the mark on my arm. "This is an ancient text," Klein explained. "It's one of the oldest records I've found that references these beings. The symbol you see here, it's the same one on your arm. It's a mark of ownership, a way for them to track and control their targets." "Ownership?" The word sent a chill down my spine. "So they think they own me?" "In a sense, yes," Klein said. "Once you're marked, you're part of their plan, whatever that may be. But there's more to it than just control. The symbol is also a link, connection between you and them. Through it, they can influence you, communicate with you, even take you." I looked at the mark on my arm, now more ominous than ever. "So what can we do? Is there a way to break the connection?" Klein sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "There are theories, rituals, methods that might disrupt the connection, but none of them are guaranteed. The truth is, we're dealing with forces beyond our understanding. These beings operate on a level that transcends our reality, and they've been doing so for eons. But there might be a way to protect yourself, to buy us more time." How? I asked, my heart pounding. There are ancient symbols, wards that have been used throughout history to protect against these entities. I've studied them extensively, and while I can't promise they'll work, they might help to keep them at bay for a while. Klein rose from his chair and walked over to a drawer, pulling out a small box. Inside were several pieces of paper, each one covered in intricate symbols and pattern. He handed me one of the papers, the symbols almost pulsating as I looked at them. Place this in your home, preferably near where you sleep, Klein instructed. It's a ward designed to disrupt the energy that these beings use to cross into our world. It won't stop them completely, but it might weaken their influence, make it harder for them to reach you. I took the paper, my fingers trembling. And what about the mark? What if they come for me again? Klein hesitated, then reached into the drawer again, this time pulling out a small, silver amulet. It was inscribed with the same symbol as the one on the paper, but much more detailed, the lines intricate and precise. Wear this, he said, handing it to me. It's an old talisman, one that's been used by various cultures to ward off evil spirits. It might not be enough to stop them, but it could provide some protection. At the very least, it'll serve as a reminder that you're not alone in this. I slipped the amulet over my head, the cool metal resting against my chest. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small measure of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. Thank you, I whispered, the weight of everything I'd learned pressing down on me. I don't know what else to do. Klein placed a hand on my shoulder, his gaze steady. We'll figure this out together. You're not the first to face this, and you won't be the last, but we'll find a way to fight back. Despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I felt a spark of determination flare up. I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Whatever these beings were, whatever they wanted, I wasn't going to let them take me without a fight. But even as I made that silent vow, the hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the walls of Klein's house. The light in the room flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows. My heart raced, and I saw the same fear reflected in Klein's eyes. They're close, he said, his voice tight with urgency. We need to prepare. They'll try to break through the wards, and when they do, we'll have to be ready. I nodded, gripping the amulet tightly, the metal warm against my skin. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I knew that whatever was coming, it would test us both in ways we could never have imagined. And then the lights went out. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on us like a living entity. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls of Klein's house, as if the very air was alive with their presence. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a frantic drum of terror. Klein moved quickly, his movements sure and practiced. He lit a candle, the small flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. Stay close, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. They're trying to break through. I gripped the amulet around my neck, the metal warm against my skin. The symbols on the paper Klein had given me seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, pulsing in time with the hum. The house creaked and groaned, as if under immense pressure, and the temperature dropped sharply, chill settling into my bones. They can't cross into our world easily, Klein said, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting the walls to come alive. But once they find a way, they won't stop. A sudden sharp crack echoed through the house, and the windows rattled in their frames. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. The hum was almost deafening now, a low, insistent drone that filled every corner of the room. I could feel it inside my head, a relentless, invasive presence that threatened to overwhelm me. They're close, Klein muttered, his face pale in the dim light. Too close. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow all sound. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the next move. The silence stretched on, and I began to wonder if it was over. Maybe the wards had held, maybe we were safe, for now. But then a soft, whispering voice filled the room, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Come to us. The words sent a jolt of terror through me, my blood turning to ice. It was the same voice I had heard in my dreams, the voice that had haunted me since that night in the woods. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence that pressed down on us, making it hard to breathe. Klein grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Now." We stumbled through the darkness, the candle flickering wildly as we made our way to a small door at the back of the house. Klein shoved it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. The air was colder here, the stone walls damp and slick with moisture. "This way," Klein urged, leading me down the stairs. The steps creaked under our weight, the sound echoing in the confined space. Basement was small, cluttered with boxes and old furniture, but Klein headed straight for a door at the far end. He fumbled with a set of keys, hands shaking as he unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside was a small room, the walls lined with strange symbols drawn in chalk, glowing faintly in the darkness. A large, circular symbol was etched into the floor, its intricate lines radiating out from the center like a spider's web. "Stand in the circle," Klein instructed, his voice tight with fear. "It's a protective ward. It should keep them out, at least for a while." I stepped into the circle, cold stone pressing against my bare feet. Air inside the room felt different, heavier, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Klein joined me, his eyes fixed on the door as he muttered a low chant under his breath. The whispering voices grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of sound. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the symbols glowing brighter as the voices intensified. I could feel the pressure building, a force pushing against the ward, testing its strength. "They're trying to break through," Klein said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Hold on. Just hold on." Pressure grew unbearable, and the room seemed to vibrate with the force of it. I clutched the amulet, my knuckles white, as the voices reached a fever pitch. The walls began to crack, hairline fractures spreading like veins through the stone. And then, with a deafening roar, the door exploded inward, splinters flying through the air. The force of it knocked us both off our feet. The protective circle shattered. I looked up, my vision swimming, and saw them. Tall, shadowy figures with glowing eyes stepping through the broken doorway. Klein struggled to his feet, his face a mask of determination. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the back of the room. But it was too late. The beings moved faster than anything I had ever seen, closing the distance in the blink of an eye. I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder, the touch like ice against my skin. The world around me seemed to distort, the edges of my vision blurring as a strange, disorienting sensation washed over me. It was as if reality itself was unraveling, the boundaries between our world and theirs dissolving. Klein shouted something, his voice distant and muffled, but I couldn't make out the words. The pressure on my shoulder increased, pulling me backward, away from Klein, away from the room, away from everything I knew. And then, with a final, agonizing wrench, the world went black. When I came to, I was floating in a sea of blackness, weightless, as if suspended in space. The air, if there was any, felt thick and oppressive, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The cold was all-encompassing, biting deep into my bones, leaving me shivering uncontrollably. There was no up or down, no sense of direction, just endless darkness in every direction. Panic welled up inside me, a primal fear of the unknown, of being lost in this void forever. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy and sluggish, as if they were encased in lead. "Where am I?" I thought, the question echoing in my mind, but no sound came out. My voice was swallowed by the void, lost in the emptiness. And then, just as the panic threatened to overwhelm me, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was small at first, a tiny pinprick of brightness against the endless black, but it grew steadily, pulsing with a cold blue radiance. The light seemed to draw me toward it, a strange, magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. As I drifted closer, the light began to take shape, forming into a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through me, but I couldn't stop moving, couldn't turn away. The figure raised a hand, and I felt an invisible force wrap around me, pulling me closer. Its eyes bored into mine, those cold, alien orbs filled with an intelligence that was both terrifying and incomprehensible. I felt exposed, as if the figure could see every thought, every fear, every secret I had ever kept. "You are the chosen," the figure's voice echoed in my mind, old and emotionless. "You are the key." The words filled me with dread, a deep, gnawing fear that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. The key to what? I tried to ask, but my voice was still trapped, lost in the void. The figure didn't answer, but the pull grew stronger, dragging me closer until I was nearly face to face with it. The light from its eyes was blinding now, searing into my vision, filling my mind with a cacophony of images, flashes of places and things that were alien and incomprehensible. I saw vast, desolate landscapes under strange, alien skies, towering structures made of dark, shimmering material, and creatures that defied description, shifting and changing before my eyes. It was too much, too overwhelming, and I felt my mind begin to fray at the edges, threatening to unravel completely. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed by the madness, figure released me. The force holding me vanished, and I was plunged back into the void, darkness swallowing me whole. I tumbled through the blackness, my senses reeling, until I hit something solid. The impact knocked the breath out of me, and I lay there gasping, my body aching and disoriented. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up and tried to take in my surrounding. I was back in Klein's house, but it was different, distorted. The walls were twisted, furniture warped and stretched in impossible ways. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, buzzing with a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Klein was lying on the floor a few feet away, unconscious but alive. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, as if he had been through the same ordeal. I crawled over to him, my movements sluggish and disjointed, and shook his shoulder. "Klein," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Klein, wake up." He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, they were unfocused, filled with confusion and fear, but then recognition dawned, and he sat up, wincing in pain. Where are we?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, glancing around at the warped room. I don't know how to explain it. We were somewhere else in the void, and there was this figure. Said I was the key." Klein's eyes widened in horror. "The key?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "No, it can't be." "What do they want?" I asked, my voice filled with desperation. "Why me?" Klein didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, his gaze flickering with a mix of fear and determination. "We're still connected to their realm," he said finally. "We haven't fully crossed back into our world yet. They've taken us to a place between dimensions, a liminal space. That's why everything is so distorted." "How do we get out?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We need to break the connection," Klein said, getting to his feet with difficulty. "But it's risky. We're on the edge of their domain, and if we don't do it right, we could end up trapped here forever." My heart sank at the thought of being stuck in this twisted reality, but I knew we had no choice. "What do we have to do?" Klein reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver knife, its blade inscribed with the same symbols that were on the amulet. "This is an atham," he explained, "a ritual knife. It's used in various ceremonies to cut through spiritual bonds. We need to use it to sever the connection between us and their realm." He handed me the athame, the metal cold and heavy in my hand. "You have to do it," Klein said, his voice steady, filled with a strange sadness. "You're the one they've chosen. The connection is strongest with you." I stared at the knife, my hand trembling. "What if I can't do it? What if I make it worse?" Klein placed a hand on my shoulder, his gaze intense. "You can do this. You have to. If we don't sever the connection, they'll keep pulling us back into their realm, using you as a conduit." The weight of his words settled on me like a lead blanket, but I knew he was right. I had to try, no matter how terrified I was. With a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the athame and looked around the room. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Stand in the center of the room," Klein instructed, his voice firm. "Focus on the connection, the pull you feel toward their realm. Use the athame to cut through it, as if you're slicing through a rope. Imagine the bond snapping, breaking apart completely." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and moved to the center of the room. The air was thick with energy, buzzing with a low hum that vibrated through my bones. I could feel the pull, a subtle tugging sensation deep in my chest, drawing me toward something I couldn't see. Closing my eyes, I raised the athame, its blade glinting in the dim, distorted light. I focused on the pull, connection between me and their realm, and tried to visualize it. Thick, dark rope, binding me to their world. With a trembling hand, I brought the athame down, slicing through the air. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, I felt it. A sudden, sharp release, like a taut cord snapping. The air around me seemed to shudder, the hum intensifying for a brief moment before fading into silence. When I opened my eyes, the room was still. The distorted walls and furniture remained, but the oppressive energy had lessened. Connection between me and their realm weakened. But it wasn't enough. I could still feel the pull, weaker now, but still there. "It's not working," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. Klein stepped forward, his expression grim. "We're too deep in their domain. We need to sever it completely. But to do that, I have to break the final bond." "What final bond?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "The one between you and me. They're using our connection to anchor us here. If I sever it, you'll be free. But I might not make it back." "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Klein said, his voice firm. "This is the only way. You have to survive. You're the key. They need you. If you can get out, you can find a way to stop them." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at Klein, my heart breaking at the thought of losing him. He had been my guide, my protector, the only one who understood what I was going through. And now he was about to sacrifice himself to save me. "Please," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "Don't do this." Klein smiled, a sad, weary smile. "It's okay," he said gently. "This is what I've been preparing for. I've spent my life trying to understand these beings, trying to find a way to stop them. If this is what it takes, then so be it." He took the athame from my hand and moved to the center of the room, standing where I had just been. The air around him seemed to thicken, the pull of the connection intensifying. He closed his eyes, his face calm and resolute, and raised the athame. "Goodbye," he whispered, and then, with a swift, decisive motion, he brought the blade down. The room exploded with light, blinding, searing brightness that filled every corner, every crevice. The walls shook, floor trembled, and a deafening roar filled my ears. I felt myself being pulled, dragged back through the void, away from the light, away from Klein. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The light vanished, and I was thrown into darkness. I awoke to silence. My body felt heavy, anchored to the cold, hard ground beneath me. Darkness was still there, but it was different. Less oppressive, less alive. I wasn't in the void anymore. I was back in the real world, or at least something close to it. For a long moment, I just lay there, trying to piece together what had happened. My mind was a fog of fragmented memories. Klein, the athame, the light. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a deep, gnawing emptiness where something important had been torn away. Klein. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I forced myself to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in my muscles. I was no longer in the twisted version of Klein's house. I was lying on a forest floor, surrounded by tall, ancient trees whose branches formed a dense canopy overhead. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and wet leaves. But there was something off, something unnatural about the forest. The trees were too still, air too silent. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, nothing moved. Except for me. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. I slowly got to my feet, every movement sending a jolt of pain through my body. My clothes were torn and dirty, my skin scraped and bruised. The amulet around my neck was still there, its weight a small, reassuring presence against my chest. Klein was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace of what had happened. I called out his name, my voice echoing through the stillness, but there was no response, just the silence, deep and unyielding. Panic began to set in, my thoughts spiraling as I turned in circles, looking for any sign of where I was or how I had gotten here. "Klein!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. "Klein, where are you?" There was nothing. I was alone. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't afford to break down. Not now. I had to find a way out of here, figure out what had happened, and somehow find Klein, if he was still alive. But deep down, I knew the truth. Klein had sacrificed himself to sever the connection, to break the bond that held us in that liminal space. He had given his life to save mine, to give me a chance to escape. The thought was like a knife in my heart, the pain sharp and unbearable. I stumbled through the forest, my steps unsteady, each breath a struggle. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks tall and forbidding, their branches intertwining to form a dark, impenetrable barrier. It was like being trapped in a maze with no clear direction, no way out. As I walked, the silence weighed heavily on me, amplifying every sound I made. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rasp of my breath, pounding of my heart. I had no sense of time, no idea how long I had been wandering. Hours could have passed, or maybe just minutes. The forest was timeless, endless. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. Faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was a cold, blue light, similar to the one I had seen in the void, but weaker, more subdued. My heart leaped in my chest, a mix of hope and fear. I had no idea what the light was, but it was the only thing I had to go on. I pushed through the undergrowth, my pace quickening despite the exhaustion that weighed down my limbs. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, more defined, and I could see that it was emanating from a small clearing up ahead. When I finally reached the clearing, I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the clearing was a large stone circle, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in intricate carvings that glowed with that same blue light. The air around the circle hummed with energy, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to resonate deep within my bones. And there, lying in the center of the circle, was Klein. He was motionless, his body still and pale, as if all the life had been drained from him. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, almost serene, but there was no mistaking it. It was gone. The sight of him, so still, so lifeless, sent a wave of grief crashing over me, and I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. I crawled to his side, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch him. His skin was cold, unnaturally so, and I recoiled, a sob catching in my throat. I had known, deep down, that he was gone. But seeing him like this, it made it real in a way that was unbearable. For a long time, I just sat there crying, my tears falling onto the cold stone. The light from the carvings pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, and I could feel the energy of the circle thrumming through the air, a presence that was both comforting and terrifying. Eventually, the tears stopped, leaving me hollow and numb. I knew I couldn't stay here forever, but I couldn't bring myself to leave him. Not like this. I had to do something, anything, to honor his sacrifice, to make sure that his death wasn't in vain. I looked down at the athame, still clutched in Klein's hand, the blade stained with dried blood. Gently, I pried it from his fingers, feeling the weight of it in my hand. The symbols on the blade seemed to glow faintly in the light from the circle, and I felt a strange sense of purpose settle over me. Klein had said that I was the key, that they needed me for something. But maybe, just maybe, I could use that against them. Maybe I could find a way to finish what Klein had started, stop these beings from ever taking anyone else. I took a deep breath and rose to my feet, the athame held tightly in my hand. The circle of light around me pulsed as if in response, and I felt a surge of energy pass through me, filling me with a strange, almost alien strength. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered, my voice trembling but determined. "You took Klein from me. You tried to take everything from me, but I'm still here, and I'm going to stop you." The light in the circle brightened, the hum growing louder, and I knew that they could hear me, that they were watching. I raised the athame and began to carve into the air, tracing the same symbols that were etched into the blade, the same ones that had protected me before. As I worked, the light around me flickered, the air growing thick with energy. I could feel the connection to their realm, a thin, fragile thread that still bound me to them. I focused all my will on severing it completely. The athame cut through the air, leaving a trail of glowing symbols in its wake, and with each stroke, I felt the connection weakening, fraying at the edges. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and the light in the circle began to flicker wildly, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Then, with a final decisive slash, connection snapped. The light exploded outward, blinding flash that filled the clearing, and I was thrown backward, force of it knocking the breath out of me. I landed hard on the ground, pain shooting through my body, but I didn't care. I had done it. I had broken the connection. The light faded, leaving the clearing in darkness. The hum was gone, the air still and silent once more. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly overhead. The void was gone. beings were gone. And I was free. But at what cost? When I finally found the strength to move, I crawled back to Klein's side, my heart heavy with grief. I placed the athame beside him, a small token of my gratitude, and whispered a silent goodbye. Then, with a heavy heart, I turned and walked away, leaving the clearing and Klein behind. The days blurred together as I wandered through the forest, the weight of Klein's sacrifice heavy on my shoulders. The silence of the woods was oppressive, pressing down on me like a tangible force. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their twisted branches whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't know where I was going. I just walked, driven by some instinct to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the clearing where Klein had died. My thoughts were a tangled mess of grief and anger, fear and confusion. But through it all, one thought burned brightly. I had to make sure this never happened again. The beings, those shadowy figures that had haunted my nightmares and stolen Klein's life, were still out there. I had severed the connection, but I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel them, lurking at the edges of my consciousness, waiting for another chance to strike. I had to find a way to stop them, to end their reign of terror once and for all. I was just one person, alone and lost in a world that had become alien and unfamiliar. How could I possibly hope to stand against beings that existed beyond the boundaries of reality? As I walked, I thought about Klein, about the things he had told me, the secrets he had uncovered. In his years of research, he had devoted his life to understanding these beings, to finding a way to protect others from their influence. And now, all that knowledge was mine. It was up to me to carry on his work, to use what he had taught me to fight back. But I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. The thought filled me with a renewed sense of purpose, a spark of hope in the darkness. There had to be others out there. People like Klein, who knew about the beings, who were willing to fight them. I just had to find them. With that thought in mind, I began to make my way out of the forest, following the faint traces of a path that seemed to wind its way through the trees. The terrain was rugged and uneven, the ground littered with fallen branches and rocks, but I pushed on, determined to reach civilization. Forest gradually thinned, the trees becoming less dense, until finally I emerged into a clearing. The sight that greeted me was both familiar and alien, a small, rural town nestled at the foot of a range of mountains. It was the same town I had driven through before finding Klein's house, but something about it felt off, as if I were seeing it through a distorted lens. I made my way down the hill toward the town, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The streets were deserted, the houses dark and silent, as if the town had been abandoned. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the empty streets. When I reached the town square, I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the center of the square, was a small stone church, its steeple rising into the sky like a sentinel. The sight of it filled me with a strange sense of foreboding, but I couldn't turn back now. I needed answers. I approached the church, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestone street. The doors were slightly ajar, creaking as they moved in the wind. Taking a deep breath, I pushed them open and stepped inside. The interior of the church was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering candles on the altar. The air was thick with the scent of incense and dust, and a strange energy seemed to hang in the air, a low hum that resonated deep within me. As I made my way down the aisle, I noticed something strange. Symbols, similar to the ones Klein had shown me, carved into the wooden pews and painted on the walls. They glowed faintly in the dim light, their meaning just out of reach. But I could feel their power, their connection to the beings I had encountered. At the front of the church, standing beside the altar, was an old man dressed in a simple robe. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp and piercing as they locked onto mine. There was something about him, something familiar, as if I had seen him before, in a dream or a vision. "Welcome," the man said, his voice deep and resonant. "I've been expecting you." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Who are you?" I finally asked, my voice trembling. The man smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "I am Brother Elias, the last guardian of this place. And you are the one who was chosen, the one who severed the connection." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "How do you know about that?" I have been watching, Brother Elias said, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. We have been watching. The order I belong to was founded centuries ago, dedicated to protecting this world from the beings you encountered. We have been preparing for this moment for a long time. Protecting? I repeated, a surge of anger rising within me. Then why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you save Klein? Brother Elias's expression softened, and he lowered his gaze. We are not as powerful as you might think. The beings you encountered exist beyond the boundaries of our reality, and their influence is difficult to resist. We have done what we could, but we are few, and they are many. The weight of his words pressed down on me, the anger fading into a deep, weary sadness. So what now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What am I supposed to do? You are the key, Brother Elias said, his tone matter-of-fact. The beings chose you for a reason. You have a connection to their realm that others do not. With the knowledge Klein passed on to you and the strength you've shown in severing the connection, you have the power to fight back. But I don't know how, I said, the frustration and fear bubbling up again. I'm just one person. How can I possibly stand against them? You are not alone, Brother Elias said, his voice gentle but firm. There are others like you, scattered across the world, fighting in their own ways. And we, the Guardians, will guide you, teach you what you need to know. But you must be willing to take the first step. I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, but all I saw was a deep, unwavering resolve. This man, this Guardian, believed in me, in my ability to fight back, and make a difference. It was a daunting thought, overwhelming in its enormity, but it was also a glimmer of hope. What do I have to do? Asked, voice steady. Brother Elias nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. The beings are drawn to places where the boundaries between worlds are thin, where their influence can seep through. We must find these places and strengthen the barriers, using the knowledge passed down through our order. He gestured to the symbols carved into the pews and walls. These symbols are part of the ancient language of protection, a language that resonates with the fabric of reality itself. With your connection to their realm, you can amplify their power, creating barriers that will keep the beings at bay. I looked around at the symbols, feeling their energy pulsing through the air. But what about Klein? I asked, my voice catching. He said I was the key. What did he mean? Klein was right, Brother Elias said, voice grave. You are the key, because you have the ability to walk between worlds, to sense the presence of the beings and their influence. That power comes at a cost. Beings will seek you out, trying to reclaim what they believe is theirs. You must be vigilant, always on guard. The enormity of what he was saying sank in, a cold dread settling in my stomach. I had thought that severing the connection would free me, but instead, it had marked me as a target. The beings wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and I was the only thing standing in their way. But I couldn't back down now. Not after everything that had happened. Not after Klein's sacrifice. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. I'll do it, I said, my voice strong despite the fear gnawing at my inside. I'll help you stop them. Brother Elias smiled, a warm, reassuring smile. Good, we have much to do, and time is not on our side. The beings are growing stronger, and their influence is spreading. Together, we can push them back, close the gaps in the barriers, and protect this world. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, its grip firm and steady. Welcome to the fight. The days that followed were a whirlwind of learning and preparation. Brother Elias taught me the ancient language of protection, the symbols and rituals that had been passed down through generations of guardians. It was a difficult and often frustrating process, but I was driven by a single-minded determination to stop the beings, to make sure that Klein's death wasn't in vain. The town, it turned out, was one of the few remaining strongholds, the Guardian, a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin, but reinforced by powerful protection. The other inhabitants were Guardians as well, each with their own roles and responsibilities in the fight against the beings. They welcomed me with open arms, treating me as one of their own, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I didn't feel so alone. But even as I threw myself into the work, the fear lingered, constant shadow in the back of my mind. The beings were out there, watching, waiting for their chance to strike. and I knew that the real battle was yet to come. As the weeks turned into months, I grew stronger, more confident in my abilities. The Guardians and I traveled to other places where the boundaries were thin, reinforcing the barriers with the ancient symbols, pushing back the influence of the being. Each success was a small victory, a step closer to keeping them at bay. But the fight was far from over. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt it. Cold, creeping sensation that crawled up my spine, a whispering at the edge of my consciousness. I sat up, my heart racing, and reached for the amulet around my neck. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly in the darkness, their light a small comfort against the growing fear. They were coming. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the athame from the table beside me, the blade's cold metal reassuring in my hand. I could feel their presence, stronger than before, closer. They were trying to break through, to tear down the barriers we had fought so hard to reinforce. I ran out of the room and down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I had to get to Brother Elias to warn him. But as I reached the door to his quarters, it burst open, and he staggered out, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "They're here," he gasped, clutching his chest. "The barriers, they're breaking through." Before I could respond, a deafening roar filled the air, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and I struggled to keep my balance as a blinding light filled the hallway, seeping through the cracks in the walls and floor. "They're trying to pull us into their realm," Brother Elias shouted over the noise. "We have to hold the line, or all will be lost." He raised his hands, chanting in the ancient language, and the symbols on the walls and floor flared to life, their light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. But it wasn't enough. The pressure was too great, the power of the being was overwhelming. "Help me," cried, his voice strained with effort. "Use the symbols, amplify their power." I didn't hesitate. I raised the athame and began carving the symbols into the air, pouring all my will, all my strength into the act. The symbols glowed with a fierce intensity, their light joining with the others, creating a barrier of energy that pushed back against the being's influence. But they kept coming, their presence a dark, malevolent force that clawed at the edges of reality, trying to drag us into their world. The light flickered, the barrier wavering under the assault, and I could feel the strain, the effort of holding them back taking its toll on me. "We can't hold them off forever," Brother Elias gasped, sweat streaming down his face. "We have to close the rift, seal it before it's too late." "But how?" I shouted, my voice hoarse with effort. "How do we close it?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate determination. "You have to go in. Use your connection to their realm. Find the source of the rift and seal it from the inside. It's the only way." The words sent a chill down my spine. Go into their realm? The thought was terrifying, the idea of facing them on their own turf almost too much to bear. But I knew he was right. If we didn't close the rift, they would break through, and everything we had fought for would be lost. "I'll do it," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "Tell me what I need to do." Brother Elias nodded, his expression grim. "Take the athame, use it to carve the symbols of sealing once you find the rift's source. But be careful. Their realm is not like ours. It will try to deceive you, to trap you. Trust in the symbols and in yourself." I took a deep breath, gripping the athame tightly. The weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me, but I pushed the fear aside, focusing on the task at hand. This was what Klein had prepared me for, what all the training had led to. I couldn't fail now. Brother Elias began chanting again, the symbols around us flaring to life, creating a small, protected space in the midst of the encroaching darkness. I stepped into the center of the circle, my heart pounding in my chest. "Good luck," Brother Elias said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the being's attack. "May the Guardians watch over you." I nodded, then closed my eyes and focused, letting the energy of the symbols flow through me, guiding me. I could feel the pull of the rift, connection to their realm, and I let it take me, dragging me across the boundaries of reality. The world around me dissolved into darkness, the noise and light fading away until there was nothing but the void. I was weightless, floating in the emptiness, the only sound my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. And then, out of the darkness, they came. The beings surrounded me, their forms shifting and indistinct, shadows within shadows. Their presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that bore down on me from all sides, suffocating in its intensity. I could feel their malice, their hunger, as they reached for me, trying to pull me deeper into their world. But I didn't waver. I raised the athame and began carving the symbols into the void, each stroke cutting through the darkness like a knife. The symbols glowed with a brilliant light, pushing back against the beings, creating a small bubble of protection around me. But it wasn't enough. The beings pressed closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, trying to worm their way into my mind, to break my concentration. I could feel the rift ahead of me, a tear in the fabric of reality, pulsing with a sickly, unnatural light. I pushed forward, fighting against the pressure, the weight of the being's presence. The rift was close, so close, but the closer I got, the stronger their influence became, the more difficult it was to resist. And then, just as I reached the rift, I saw it. Figure, standing in the darkness, watching me. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the familiar face, the figure of the man who had died to save me. "Klein," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, watching, its eyes dark and empty. Cold dread settled in my stomach as I realized the truth. It wasn't Klein, it was a trap, a trick of the beings, designed to distract me, pull me away from my goal. But the sight of him, the thought of what I had lost, it was almost too much to bear. I felt myself faltering, my resolve weakening. But then I remembered Brother Elias's words, "Trust in the symbols, and in yourself." I closed my eyes, blocking out the image, the whispers, focusing on the task at hand. With a final, desperate effort, I plunged the athame into the rift, carving the symbols of sealing into its surface. The light flared, blindingly bright, and the rift shuddered, the fabric of reality twisting and writhing as it fought against the closure. The beings screamed, a sound that echoed through the void, cry of rage and despair as they were pulled back, their connections severed. The rift shrank, the light fading, until finally it was gone, leaving nothing but darkness behind. And then, there was silence. I floated in the void, my body trembling with exhaustion, my mind reeling from the effort. But I had done it. The rift was closed, the beings pushed back. The world was safe, at least for now. But at what cost? As the darkness closed in around me, I felt a strange sense of peace, calm that settled over me like a blanket. The beings were gone, but so was the connection, the tether that had bound me to their world. I was free. And then, slowly, the darkness began to lift, the void dissolving into light. I felt a pull, a gentle tug, drawing me back to the world I had fought so hard to protect. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on the floor of the church, the symbols around me still glowing faintly. Brother Elias was kneeling beside me, his face lined with worry, but when he saw me stir, a look of relief washed over him. "You did it," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "You actually did it." I sat up slowly, my body aching, every muscle protesting, but the pain was a small price to pay. I had survived. I had won. Now, Brother Elias helped me to my feet, his grip steady and reassuring. "The rift is closed," he said, his voice steady. "But this is only the beginning. There will be others, and we must be ready." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. The battle was far from over, but I was ready to face it. I had to be. The night sky over the town seemed more tranquil now, a deceptive calm that belied the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. The street lamps flickered in the darkness as Brother Elias and I walked back to the town square, the air crisp and filled with the scent of earth and pine. The events of the night were still fresh in my mind, a whirlwind of light and darkness, fear and resolve. As we reached the town square, a few of the guardians emerged from their homes, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. They had felt the disturbance, sensed the shift in the balance, but they had not known the full extent of what had transpired. Seeing me alive and standing beside Brother Elias brought a mix of relief and anxiety. "Is it over?" one of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, asked as she approached us. "For now," Brother Elias replied, his voice steady. "The rift has been sealed, and the beings have been pushed back. But the threat remains. We need to be vigilant." The woman nodded, her expression grim. "We'll increase the patrols, strengthen the wards. We can't afford any more breaches." I listened to their conversation, my mind still spinning from the night's events. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was no time to rest. The battle was far from over, and the next steps needed to be planned carefully. "Are there any immediate threats?" I asked, my voice hoarse but determined. Brother Elias glanced at me, a look of approval in his eyes. "The immediate threat has been dealt with, but we must remain alert. The beings will not give up easily. They will look for other weaknesses, other opportunities to breach our defenses. We should also focus on fortifying our own defenses," the woman said, her tone practical. "The more we can strengthen the barriers, the better." I nodded in agreement. "What can I do to help?" Brother Elias looked at me, thoughtful expression on his face. "You have already done much, but your connection to their realm is unique. We need to harness that connection, understand it better, and use it to our advantage." He led me to a small stone building at the edge of the square, a structure that had been converted into a research and training center for the Guardians. Inside, the walls were lined with books and scrolls, ancient texts and modern research, all focused on the beings and their influence. "We've been compiling information for years," Brother Elias explained as we entered. "Much of it is theoretical, but there are valuable insights to be gained. We need to analyze everything we have, refine our strategies, and prepare for the next phase." I spent the next few days immersed in research and training. The Guardians were skilled, their knowledge extensive, and I learned quickly. We studied the symbols, the rituals, the patterns of the beings' attacks. We mapped out potential weak points in the barriers and developed new techniques for reinforcing them. Despite the intense focus on our work, my mind often drifted back to that moment in the void, when I had seen the figure of Klein. It haunted me, a reminder of the cost of our fight and the sacrifices that had been made. One evening, as I was poring over ancient texts and meticulously documenting the symbols in a quiet corner of the research center, a soft knock echoed through the building. I looked up to see Brother Elias standing in the doorway, his face lined with a mix of concern and anticipation. "We've identified a new potential breach," he said, stepping inside. "The barriers are holding for now, but there's been unusual activity reported near the edge of the town's protective wards." I straightened, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What kind of activity?" "It's difficult to say," Elias replied. "There have been sightings of shadowy figures, disturbances in the energy field, and some of the Guardians have reported feeling an intense, oppressive presence." I grabbed my jacket and followed Elias out of the research center. The night air was cool and biting, and the stars above seemed to pulse with an eerie light, as if they were aware of the turmoil below. The town was quieter than usual, the streets deserted, and the shadows longer, stretching across the cobblestones like dark fingers. Elias led me to the edge of town, where a group of Guardians had gathered, their faces tense and focused. They were arrayed around a series of symbols laid out on the ground, their light flickering uneasily in the dark. The symbols were designed to reinforce the barriers and detect any anomalies in the energy field. "This is where the disturbance has been reported," Elias said, voice low. "We need to determine the source of the activity and address it before it escalates." I nodded and joined the group, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. The feeling in the air was different from before, thicker, more oppressive. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with a malevolent force, pressing down on us. One of the Guardians, a young man named Aiden, pointed to a spot on the ground where the energy seemed to be shifting. "We've been seeing fluctuations here. It's as if something is trying to push through." I crouched beside him and examined the area. The symbols, which were normally stable and glowing steadily, were flickering erratically. I could sense a disturbance in the energy, a tugging at the edges of the protective barrier. "We need to reinforce the symbols and stabilize the energy flow," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "If we can strengthen the barrier, it should help counteract whatever's trying to get through." Elias nodded in agreement. "Prepare the protective seals and reinforce the barriers. We need to act quickly." The Guardians moved into action, carefully tracing additional symbols on the ground and chanting the ancient protective incantation. I joined them, focusing on amplifying the power of the symbols, drawing on my connection to the realm beyond. The energy in the air surged, the symbols glowing with renewed intensity. As we worked, the oppressive presence seemed to intensify, a dark pressure building in the air. I could feel the being's influence growing stronger, their attempts to breach the barriers more aggressive. The light from the symbols flickered and danced, struggling to hold back the encroaching darkness. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The guardians worked in synchrony, their movements precise and practiced. But it was clear that the strain was taking its toll. I could see the exhaustion on their faces, hear the strain in their voices. "We're close," Aiden said, voice strained. "Just a little more." I focused on the symbols, channeling my energy into them, trying to push back against the darkness. The symbols flared with a brilliant light, the barriers stabilizing as the energy flowed more evenly. Pressure in the air began to ease, the oppressive feeling lifting slightly. But the relief was short-lived. The disturbance seemed to ebb and flow, the being's presence relentless. I could sense them probing at the edges of the barrier, searching for weaknesses, trying to find a way through. "We need to find the source of the disturbance," Elias said, his voice firm. "It's not enough to just reinforce the barriers. We have to identify and address the cause." I nodded, my mind racing. The disturbance felt like it was coming from a specific direction. Point of concentration in the energy field. Concentrated, trying to pinpoint the exact location. "There," I said, pointing to a spot further away from the town. "The disturbance seems to be centered there. If we can locate and neutralize the source, we should be able to prevent further breaches." Elias and the Guardians quickly prepared to investigate, gathering their equipment and setting out toward the identified location. I stayed close to Elias, my mind still reeling from the intensity of the disturbance. As we approached the area, the feeling of darkness grew stronger, almost palpable. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. Protective symbols on the ground were dim and unstable, struggling to hold back the encroaching force. We reached a small clearing at the edge of the protective wards. In the center there was a large, gaping tear in the fabric of reality, its edges pulsating with a sickly, greenish light. The disturbance was coming from this rift, a breach that was allowing the being's influence to seep through. "This is the source," Elias said, voice grim. "We need to close it, but it will require a significant effort." I nodded, stepping forward. The rift was a chilling sight, its presence a stark reminder of the being's power. The symbols around it were barely visible, their light flickering weakly. "We'll need to use the athame," I said, pulling it from the protective pouch where I kept it. "It's the only way to carve the symbols of sealing directly into the rift." Elias nodded, his expression resolute. "Be careful. The beings will try to resist. Focus on the symbols and the ritual." I took a deep breath and approached the rift, feeling the cold pressure of the being's influence pressing against me. The rift's light was blinding, its energy chaotic and turbulent. I raised the athame and began to carve the symbols into the rift, each stroke precise and deliberate. As I worked, the being's presence grew more aggressive, their whispers turning into shrieks of rage. The pressure around me increased, and I could feel their attempts to break through, to pull me into their realm. I focused on the symbols, channeling all my energy into them, trying to push back against the darkness. The light from the symbols flared brightly, zapped the rift shuddering as the energy fought against the being's influence. Pressure in the air intensified, and I could feel the strain of the effort, the sheer force required to keep the rift from expanding further. Despite the darkness pressing in on me, I continued to carve the symbols, my hands steady despite the exhaustion. The rift was slowly closing, the light dimming as the symbols took hold. The being's influence was pushed back, their presence retreating as the rift was sealed. With a final intense burst of energy, I completed the last symbol. The rift shuddered, and then, with a blinding flash, it was gone. The darkness receded, the oppressive pressure lifting, leaving the clearing in eerie silence. I staggered back, my body trembling with exhaustion. Elias and the Guardians rushed to my side, their faces etched with relief and concern. "You did it," Elias said, his voice filled with awe. "The rift is closed." I nodded, my throat dry and my limbs heavy. For now, I said, my voice hoarse. But we need to remain vigilant. There will be more breaches, more attempts to get through. We'll be ready, Elias assured me. We've learned a lot tonight, and we're stronger for it. But your connection to their realm is invaluable. We need to continue to explore and understand it. The night was quiet now, the oppressive energy gone. As the Guardians began to clean up and reinforce the barriers, I felt a deep sense of weariness, both physical and emotional. The battle was far from over, and the cost of the fight weighed heavily on me. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, feeling that we had taken a significant step forward. We had faced the darkness, fought back against the beings, and emerged victorious. For now, at least, the world was safe. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the town, I looked up at the sky and felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was not over, but I was ready to face whatever came next. The Guardians gathered around me, their expressions determined and resolute. Together, we would continue to defend against the darkness, to protect the world from the beings that lurked beyond the boundaries of reality. And as I looked at the faces of my comrades, I felt a sense of hope. We were not alone in this fight. We had each other, and we had the strength to see it through. The ongoing battle had only just begun, but I knew that with courage, unity, and determination, we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The darkness would not win. We would stand strong together and protect the world from the shadows that sought to consume it.